Lindsay Whitfield is a professor at the Copenhagen Business School. She's also a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg and the University of Cape Town, and is the author of The Politics of African Industrial Policy, A Comparative Perspective. She studies how governments use industrial policy and how firms in developing countries create and capture value. Stefan Durkan is a professor at Oxford and the director of the Center for the Study of African Economies. He also previously served as the chief economist of the UK's Department of International Development and is the author of the book Gambling on Development. So I'm going to start with a few questions for Lindsay, and then I have a few questions for both of them to be in discussion. So, Lindsay, you've written extensively about green technologies. China has taken significant lead in many of these fields. Do you think these industries are still a promising thing for developing countries to pursue?
Yes, thank you. So the short answer is yes. But to tell you where I'm coming from with the answer, I want to start the starting point, which is a little bit different than green technology, so bear with me, and then I'm going to get there. The starting point is that in mature industries, the markets are saturated. And this is a point that I wanted to make after listening for 2 days. It's a comment or a point that I don't think has been raised. And you may disagree, and that's great, so we can have a debate. But I wanted to put it out there on the table. Global economic development, understood as a nonlinear process that affects all countries, not just in the global south. In global capitalism, countries can move forward and backward, they can regress, as we're seeing in Europe. But it is a zero-sum game, and that is a point that hasn't been raised. Not all countries, not all firms in all countries can be in the same industry at the same time. There is a limited amount of global demand at any given point, and that global demand can only support a given number of firms in certain countries. And there's also the fallacy of composition. So the more firms that enter causes falling prices and profit margins. We actually saw this in Europe in the 1970s. There was overcapacity in saturated markets, and this is what actually led to the opening of markets in the global south. So we can talk about that later, but it was the motivation behind structural adjustment. And if we look at the industries that have driven global capitalism, economic development in the post-World War II period, this has been predominantly a certain set of industries which have clustered together. And first, in intermediate industries, it was steel, petrochemicals, plastics, and electrical equipment. And this formed the basis of countries that moved into shipbuilding, cars, and consumer electronics. When those were saturated, and this turning point I mentioned in the 1970s in advanced economies, then we had innovation into microelectronics, and we saw the next wave of development in microelectronics and semiconductors and computers. So we're actually at a point now where even after that next generation of leading sectors that have driven growth, and that actually allowed South Korea, Taiwan, and China to develop, they are now saturated. So I like to use the analogy of a ladder, and it's all full. This is a very difficult context for late comers, which are mostly African economies, to develop. There's no space there. If you want to move into a mature industry, you have to compete with existing firms, which means you have to take market share from incumbent firms. It can be done. We have cases of it, mostly in East Asia, but it's very expensive. That was basically South Korea breaking into the automobile industry. So what I see now is the green transition offers a great opportunity. It's shaking the ladder, or it's actually creating a new ladder. And this is the best way for countries to move into new sectors. And it's not just what we're seeing now in renewable energies and batteries. And I will make 2 additional points about that. In existing green technologies that you know about, innovation is happening very fast. So just because you see some firms, Korean or Chinese, occupying or monopolizing some technologies in some markets for certain products, does not mean that that will be the case in 5 years. And second, there are many green technologies that have yet to be commercialized. So let me just give you 2 examples to put some flesh on this. I have been doing research on the EV battery supply chain in China and South Korea and Europe, so I'm going to draw partly on that. In EV batteries, as many of you know, Chinese firms are in the lead. In fact, they have outcompeted European and US firms. So when I'm talking about development being a zero-sum game, this is what I'm talking about. But battery technology is moving fast. It's what Kun Li, if he was here, would call short cycle technology. So yes, Chinese firms might have outcompeted Korean firms and US firms in NMC, what we call NMC battery chemistry, with LFP. But I will tell you that in 2 years, we will be moved on. And so with fast innovation in green technologies where there's not yet a dominant design, every time there's a change, this is a window of opportunity. And that creates space for firms to move in without directly competing with incumbent firms. And the second point is that there are so many green technologies that have yet to be commercialized. And the example that I like to give for this is plastics. We haven't even touched the decarbonization of plastics and therefore also of clothing. Most clothing today, a majority of it is made from polyester, so you're wearing fossil fuels. There are so many different ways that you can replace fossil fuel-based plastics with biopolymers and other technologies that we don't yet know. So, and here I'm coming to the end. So there are plenty of opportunities for latecomer countries to pursue in rungs on the ladder or steps on the ladder that are not yet occupied. And in many cases, the technology is actually already there. It has to be commercialized. It has to be scaled. And in fact, the hardest part is scaling the technology because the innovation is not actually in the pure technology. It's in scaling manufacturing. And that's where a lot of innovation takes place on the shop floor. Not how do you produce this, but how do you produce it profitably as a firm. And this is actually exactly what China did with batteries, because it basically copied Japanese technology at first, but it engaged in innovation in the manufacturing process and in precision manufacturing, which now US and European companies cannot mimic quickly. So here I'm going to make 2 points and then some provocative, which I hope will provoke you to think. The reason that I was asked to speak instead of Kun, who couldn't come, is because we share a similar economic school of thought. We are Schumpeterians. We are a very small tribe. We are proselytizing really strongly. So Schumpeterians' view is that wealth is created from imperfect competition. So you need to get into new industries quickly or as a first mover, as a fast follower, and you need to be the only firm that can do it, and that's where wealth is created. And that, therefore, economic development is about creating proprietary knowledge inside the firm. It's indigenizing the knowledge. It's accessing foreign knowledge, understanding it, using it, and engaging in incremental innovation, and then eventually sets the foundation for radical innovation. This is why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. Now, you asked me in the follow-up question, which African countries are best posed to do this? And I would say it's the ones whose political leaders are willing to take the risk. If you read the in-depth empirical economic history of East Asian countries, their leaders made really bold bets. We can talk about that later, but this is how South Korea and Taiwan moved into semiconductors in the late 1970s when this was a leading technology and no one could have thought they could do it. And I can talk more about later how they actually did it. But I'll stop here by saying two things I think will set the rest of the talk. It requires having industry-specific knowledge. You have to have that knowledge in the governments and the firms if you want to do industrial policy. And second, I get this a lot, if we start by saying what I just said is not possible for African countries, it surely won't be possible.
Another thread of your research agenda focuses on the linkages between local firms and national and international firms. What can a government do to build out those linkages?
So she has the benefit of having read my work. She was a very, very diligent moderator and came up with these really great questions, which forced me to prepare for them. So I'll just give some background for those of you who haven't read my work. But I am a political economist and a development economist, but the economics departments won't have me. I'm a self-made economist. But I study firms at the firm level, but I study firms embedded in industries, and national industries and global industries. And so one of the things that I have learned, and this relates to what I was just saying, is that if a country wants to move into a new industry, an industry that's new to that country, in most cases it is a mature industry in a global sense, there is no knowledge residing in the country, in the government, or in local firms. So that's what I was saying earlier, just a minute ago. I mean, that knowledge has to be accessed from foreign firms. And one of the important ways to do that is to help local firms make linkages with foreign firms. The point being, not to just have linkages to have linkages, it's how can local firms learn from incumbent firms that already have that tacit knowledge. And here is a Schumpeterian concept, but actually relates to what Lant was talking about earlier today when he said A, which is knowledge, and was not as transverse, it did not disperse as much as we thought. And that's because it's tacit. There is a lot that can be read in books, and South Korean firms and governments and Chinese firms and governments did this very well, getting all you can get from manuals and the internet and etc. But a lot about making a firm profitable, run profitably, is tacit knowledge. And that tacit knowledge is embedded in individuals, and then individuals working together in routines. And that's why Schumpeterians see firms as organizations, not production functions. So the important thing is for local firms to be able to access this knowledge and use it. And governments can help them do that, but they also have to have that industry knowledge within the government. So this is what I would have said if I was on the state capabilities panel. So Shima was talking earlier about my concept of pocket of efficiency. So the pocket part is having the political support and some degree of autonomy to pursue those objectives, but the efficiency is much more difficult. And some people haven't quite understood it. And it really means having that industry knowledge within whatever government agency, whatever state agency is going to pursue that. And let me be specific. When I say industry knowledge, I mean the technical knowledge, so it's battery chemistries if we're talking about EVs, or the whole EV vehicle if we're talking about that. But it's also knowledge of what does the global industry look like? Where is value captured? Where's the competition among different nodes? Who are the main suppliers and buyers? Who are the main firms operating? What are the competitive dynamics? And importantly, being able to engage in technological forecasting. So this knowledge won't reside in African countries or in governments. It has to be tapped. And it was the same thing for East Asian governments. And they did this in multiple ways. I'll just give you a few examples, and that's just to make things concrete. But it's also a story that's not known about Taiwan and semiconductors. Taiwan's semiconductor industrial policy was initially driven by a group of foreign former businessmen and top American companies who formed the Science and Technology Advisory Group, who basically helped some top political leaders who were engineers and who understood the significance of Intel's announcement about the microprocessor and what it would mean for the world and how much innovation there would be beyond just memory chips, which were the first ones. But they had this advisory board, and it included not economists, which I will come back to, but former businessmen of IBM and all the major incumbent businesses. They also recruited foreign nationals, many countries did this, including South Korea and China, who were living abroad and already working for companies in these sectors who had degrees from US universities. And there are other ways that I could talk about that come from actually existing cases about how this industry-specific, and I do think industrial policy has to be industry-specific, these industry-specific knowledge begins to be built within government agencies and within local firms. So local firms can use some of the same measures of tapping foreign knowledge. But the key point is that for governments to help build linkages between local firms and foreign firms, they have to have those linkages, right? And that's why I just spent a long time saying what I said, because those are the ways in which governments build those linkages, which they can then offer. And two really important aspects of that are what we call transnational technical communities. So that includes both the scientists behind the innovations, but also people who worked in these firms, and transnational social networks. And for me, as a development economist, this is an important factor that has been overlooked in almost every single narrative of successful cases. There are plenty of academic books about them. They might not be in the discipline you read, but they are there. And they show that transnational social networks, and specifically between Silicon Valley and Hsinchu, and Silicon Valley and Seoul, and later Silicon Valley and Shanghai, and also actually Silicon Valley and Bangalore, which was key to the liberalization story that Land was talking about, but he didn't mention this point. It was actually the Indians and then also the overseas ethnic Chinese, who were some Taiwanese and other, who flew back and forth between Silicon Valley and helped convince about these industries that it could happen, who transferred knowledge, who helped create firms, and then later set up their own firms. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to emphasize about the linkages, that they don't come out of nowhere. When we look at success stories and then we're like, how did this happen? If you scratch a little bit deeper under the surface, you see a lot of these person-to-person linkages, a lot of foreign knowledge being tapped, a lot of former experience in the industries, and the transnational linkages that make them possible. And so that was one of the things that I have been trying to emphasize in some of the work that I have been doing.
So I'm going to give you a deliberately provocative statement and ask how much you agree with it out of 10. So, export-driven manufacturing is no longer the best route out of poverty.
Oh, sorry, can you say it again?
Export-driven manufacturing is no longer the best route out of poverty.
Yeah, so I don't agree at all. So I guess, is that a 1 or a 10?
Let's go with a 1.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, so sorry, Stefan, if you're going to agree. That will make for a very interesting debate, because I really don't know where that comes from. It was very interesting after the second Trump administration came to power. You saw all these economists in the US trying to say that manufacturing didn't matter because they were trying to avoid the Trumpist, what they saw as protectionist policies, which didn't match with their economic ideology. But I totally disagree. And I would say we could take it on 2 levels. I like the number 2. I apparently seem to like the number 2. So export and manufacturing. Manufacturing matters and export manufacturing matters. Manufacturing matters because, as the good Schumpeterian that I am, technological capabilities are cumulative. Organizational community capabilities are cumulative. So when you get into one manufacturing industry and you gain knowledge from that, it stays within the firm, but it also spreads out to an industrial ecosystem into the country as a whole, which are capabilities that can then be built on for the next iteration of innovation. And if you look at rich countries that are still rich, that's exactly how it happens. It's also true that innovation is more likely to happen in manufacturing sectors. As Alice Amsden talked about, knowledge-based assets, these tend to be, and we can debate, but I think I will come up with more cases than the opposite side, that innovation happens more in manufacturing than in agriculture or services. And this is a hard lesson that Europe is now learning because they outsourced all their manufacturing and they're now not able to compete with Chinese firms in precision manufacturing. And also we're seeing that the ability to innovate in R&D is linked to manufacturing capabilities. And thirdly, there are definitely more spillovers from manufacturing into other industries than there is from agriculture or services. And then if I get to the export part, why does export matter? And again, I'm going to say two reasons. One is the size of domestic demand of countries at an early period cannot support the economy, the kind of economies of scale that are necessary. So exporting in countries with still lower purchasing power was necessary to access larger demand. And a larger demand is necessary to drive high volumes. And high volumes not only drive your typical economies of scale, like capital over units for fixed costs, but more importantly, it drives learning. So you go down the learning curve. And it's these two things together that push production costs down, that then make local firms able to compete in international markets. Many developing countries have learned this the hard way, especially in car manufacturing, which we talked about earlier, and South Africa is a case in point. If you cannot reach the right scale, you won't be able to support a large industry and also a large local ecosystem. And then lastly, exporting is the way to discipline firms. It doesn't actually come from industrial policy. This is a misnomer because people have misunderstood Amsden's point about reciprocal control mechanisms. Governments cannot discipline firms. This is why all of you skeptics of industrial policy are like, but how is this going to work? It's because it doesn't. It's global competitive markets which discipline firms, which make them, compel them to invest in learning, that compel them to keep up with the latest technology so they don't go bankrupt. What industrial policy can do is link incentives to exporting, but it can't discipline. Only if you are exporting will firms stay at the technological frontier and not fall behind. And to me, this was the greatest lesson that should have been learned from countries that pursued import substitution industrialization without simultaneously pursuing exports.
So let's bring Stefan in for this next question. So how useful is industrial policy in countries with little industry as yet? How do you pick winners when there aren't any winners yet?
Well, does it seem to work? No, it's okay. Okay, good. I want to turn this around. I think we focus, when trying to think about industrial policy, which, by the way, every country, every economy ever always does, and one way or another, it's just belatedly that a lot of countries like to admit. I also did it and write reports in Western countries that they do it as well. But anyway, we always do it. If you ever worked in a government, you always try to do something in the economy and try to actually promote. Maybe not exactly in the right way or whatever, but is that. But I want to actually turn it here. The picking winners is not the only important part. It's actually the ability to lose. And actually what we often forget, and in fact, when we get, I know it's being screamed and I get in trouble, when Justin Lin used to go around in Africa saying, this is how we did it, Shenzhen, look at it, it's all success. what we rarely get argued from the experience of China is that Deng Xiaoping threw 4 circles, and only one of them was successful, and the 3 others, very little research is done. And it was brought to me once in Beijing, where an old gentleman in the Development Research Center, the think tank in the State Council, was berating the younger scholars and saying, look, keep on talking only about Shenzhen, talk about the 3 others, because we learned from all these failures and we were able to fail. We do not drive around in Proton cars. We are not flying in IPTN Indonesian aircraft. Daiwo is no more. We should make sure we keep on learning, even in these ecosystems, how did they manage to fail? And actually, it's interesting because in many places, they failed very slowly. It's incredibly hard for a state-owned enterprise in Vietnam to fail. There's very little domestic business in Vietnam. It's FDI and state-owned enterprises that are not terribly efficient and which government is wrestling with trying to reform, as Abir Hassan here in the room is writing his PhD. And so this is interesting, just important. So that actually brings me to is you need to just be aware, are you going to be able to fail? And that's probably where I somewhat disagree here. And I'm not wanting to be the pessimist, but I just want to be the pragmatist on industrial policy when I come to some other countries, because there probably is at any moment in time, a feasible set of industrial policy in a place. Okay? And I do think that in Malawi, you can't do what you did in Korea. Okay? And you just want to be careful aware of it. That doesn't mean that I want to be pessimistic forever about Malawi, but just be aware what kind of state you have. Can it learn? Can it do it? Can you actually do it? Can you bring in FDI without getting the local political economy up in arms? Can you actually start doing things? Okay, and so capability, the way it exists, is important because there has to be some endogenous process of forming that. And you can't simply say, let's assume I have it, and from now on I'm going to produce cars in Malawi. We can't do that. But it doesn't mean that you can't try to do it. And actually, this probably you alluded to this. The way I like to think about it is that, well, the minimum condition is going to be self-aware of what you have to work with, self-aware of the state you have. But on top of that, just really try hard and make sure you're able to fail. And I make sure you can do this. So, and that's a political economy part as well, because, I work a lot in Pakistan these days. Their import substitution, they do export, they're all terrified, they're all obsessed with exports now because, somehow the geopolitical rents are not flowing in, so they need to do something. Just no ability to get what you just described, the good things from exporting to play the role, the proper role as a disciplining device and so on. Karachi businessmen often spend more time in Islamabad, keeping their room in this arena to lobby for further subsidies than actually trying to get the garment industry or the textile industry to be productive. So that's probably where it is. It comes back to, so this is where we agree, and also on that last question that you asked, Lindsay, this is where exports is beyond the things that Lindsay was alluding to. And yes, we may not always agree on the economics model, but the detail we agree on in the end of what it gets to it. We're getting there on the detail. And but somehow, there is the disciplining role of the market, disciplining role of competition, of international thing. But I think there's a political economy part, because once you really are committed to make exports work, you're not going to keep on overvaluing your exchange rate. You're not going to be doing stupid things that you get macroeconomic instability. And that's the other part of it on the import substitution and the industrial policy without the export part, that you just don't have that political economy disciplining device to run your economy sensibly. And then you get Pakistan with 25 IMF programs, because they just keep on never really trying to get to be serious about, to try to set themselves up to productivity standards relative to the world and trying to compete with it.
Lindsay, do you have responses?
Yeah, so I had a set point, but I want to respond to Stefan first. I think that you're right. There are many failures for every success, but we can diagnose why they failed. So I can tell you that why Proton failed, but also if you look at South Korea, people talk about South Korea car industry as a success story. It's not. Hyundai is a success story. Daewoo and Key emerged and all the other ones that I won't name, they did not make it out of the Asian financial crisis, where they realized that money was no longer cheap anymore and they couldn't just keep expanding with debt. But where the firms that didn't fail succeeded was in endogenizing knowledge.
Yeah.
And so, but that took 10 years, as Hajun Cheng liked to say, but it's also just there in the history books. And so I would also say that, yes, you will fail if you don't endogenize knowledge, but also failure is a time perspective. You have to want it. If you do it hard enough, and this is where I'm in a business school, if you work hard enough, if you keep at it, the prospects of failure are much lower than you think.
Of course, I agree with that, but it's basically, what I'm still saying is that in a lot of contexts, the political economy is not set up to learn. You need to find a way that you want to learn and you want to correct the errors. And if it's easy enough to go to the capital and lobby for further subsidies, rather than actually trying to be productive, then something is going wrong. Now, I'm not saying that Pakistan one day couldn't break into some things, but it needs to get that part. It needs to get that ability to learn. Yes, maybe patience, but they've been doing import substitution for 30 years. And
no
how
discipline.
long Malaysian cars were around, I don't know, Proton, was it 40 years or something that they tried? And, and that's the kind of point. And there will be certain political economies, it will just be harder. And we'll just be recognizing it rather than this kind of, we can do, this is where I would disagree with Hajun, we can't do a career just today everywhere. We can maybe get there, we can begin to do, but know where you start and build it up bit by bit. Because if you don't do that, you're going to go back to other kinds of failures that probably will end up with another IMF program, with other failures, with other fiscal disasters.
So it depends on what you say a Korea is. I don't know, maybe we mean different things, right? Some people say, state control, nationalization of the banks, capital controls, the government telling firms what to do. But for me, that is... that's not the story of Korea. Of course, it is there, but it's firms endogenizing knowledge. Okay, Hyundai learned to build a car on its own, but only after going through all the steps of first knockdown kits, right? Then licensing foreign technology, then producing all the car but licensing the engine, and then only 15 years later saying, "Can we now produce an engine?" And I think the story of Proton is they didn't do that. And this brings me back to the point that I wanted to say to their question, which is all countries have started with FDI because it is a way to bring foreign knowledge into the country. It is a way to bring local firms in proximity with foreign firms that they can see. It's easier. They don't have to spend a lot of money to go around and touring. And it's a good way to create jobs in countries with very low wages where you still need job-driven FDI. Fine. But it cannot be the end-all, and it actually shouldn't even be from the beginning. So I would say, yes, all countries can have an industrial policy, even if they're at the beginning, and you can start with FDI, but you need to have a long game. So even if you're bringing in the FDI at the beginning to create jobs, you need to already be thinking, how are we going to help local firms enter JVs? How are we going to help local firms be suppliers? How are we going to help local firms learn from what that firm is doing? And how to pick winners. You're right that you can't discipline a firm that just wants subsidies. So what I say is that you look for local firms that are already taking their own initiative to learn. They're investing their own meager resources in that learning effort. And we call this technological effort after Sanjay Alal. And you'd be surprised, actually, one of the questions we skipped is, is there anything that surprised you about African development recently? You'd be surprised that you could find some local firms engaging in technological effort, if you look.
So this is where I would agree, because it also implies start with the firms. Just are there firms that can actually build on? So an industrial policy where you just start saying, oh, somehow or another, I asked ITC in Geneva to do some comparative advantage study, and therefore we're now going to invest in that sector, won't work. So that's where we agree. Let's start with the firms and then build an industrial policy around it and then pick the ones that want to learn. And I agree. You go across the continent, you get local firms doing amazing things. And actually, it's not easy to know exactly how could you support them further because, you know, we're not always knowing it, but it's actually, there are places to start virtually in all places.
Given the time we live in, when it feels like tariffs change every other day, where AI capabilities are changing month to month, is industrial policy even on the right timescale? Policies always take years, sometimes they take decades to bear fruit. So can we make predictions that far out in the current day and age?
Well, you know, look, when it comes to uncertainty on anything, you know, whether it's about the skills you want to get to someone in education or the vocational training you want to do, and I'm just going to make the parallel, you want to do things that are transferable and resilient to it. So I think we're in an age where actually probably the better thing to do first, and now just doing the experience for the work we're doing in Pakistan, say, look, you know, just don't try to think we're just going to do now everything vertical. Try to think horizontal. You say sectoral, but actually I go even further horizontal. And it's an interesting thing, you know, if both of us have worked quite a lot in Ethiopia over the years, or at least followed it. And I thought it really interesting because, of course, they went in a much more benign environment. They tried to go with a lot of vertical policies. You know, I was a few days ago with Arkabi Okibai, and actually we were watching together, and he was commenting on a really great film made in Ethiopia on the kind of industrial parks and the industrial policy there. And it was fascinating. By the way, you should watch it. It's actually really, really good, very nuanced kind of view on what's happening with industrial parks. But you were trying to get somewhere in, and it was extremely vertical. But actually, it was very much sailing close to the wind. This is not like in some East Asian countries with an undervalued exchange rate, but actually with a massively overvalued exchange rate and with kind of issues like that. And so you get somehow, I think my best advice would be just also make sure you get your horizontal policies right. Things that you not quite pick the winners, but actually do it. So think carefully on your exchange rate and so on. Mamo is in the room, and what an incredible job it had to be to trying to get the macroeconomic imbalances back a little bit more stable, because it actually, you know, it began to undermine the kind of the ability of the exporters in the industrial park to actually sell abroad. There was no more forex for their inputs, and they couldn't earn the forex that they desperately needed. So there was some kind of real catch-22 thing emerging. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, you need to do it in a particular way or an East Asian way with undervalued exchange rate, but you need to do something to get the stability. So that's part of horizontal things. Get your house in order, because it's going to be harder with a lot of uncertainty to pick the exact winners. That's what I would say. What do you disagree?
Lindsay?
Yeah, so I think going back to the question, I'm not sure that all aspects of industrial policy take a lot of time, but what I actually wanted to say is different. I think the more important point for latecomer countries is that they have to start somewhere. They have to start with some industry. And what I have seen in the cases that I've looked at outside of Africa where there's success is that the more manufacturing industries you have in your country, the better. It's actually quite simple, and I can be provocative and say that China's success in batteries has to do with its success in multiple other industries that serendipitously laid the foundation that they were then able to innovate and have the whole supply chain. It wasn't planned. It wasn't some grand master communist government planning this. It was the accumulation of manufacturing industries and capabilities that have spillover effects. And we're now actually seeing it also around AI. The reason that they're leading in AI is there are multiple industries that feed into AI, and they also had these industries. So the more manufacturing capabilities and the more local industry ecosystems, the better. It creates the basis for moving into other industries and innovating in the future. And then the last thing I'll say is, though, that not all manufacturing is equal, not all economic activities are equal, but also not all manufacturing activities are equal. And this is really important for African countries because we had this discussion earlier. There are very little spillovers from garment. The innovation and the global apparel industry is in textile. Setting up a garment industry will spill over into nothing. And then we wonder why countries that had FDI in apparel haven't gone anywhere. The innovation is in the textile sector. It always has been. It was in textile that started in the UK. It was then in synthetic manufacturing linked to petrochemicals and then to wider spillover effects into plastic. I always like to give the example that the first use of synthetic fiber was in women's hosiery in the 1920s by DuPont. And from there, we got a world of plastic from women's hosiery. But the point is that, I just like to tell that story, but the point is that garment manufacturing doesn't go anywhere. So when we're trying to choose industries, I'm saying you just need to start somewhere, you need to have an industry, though we can also look at what are the potential spillover effects in different industries. So I talked earlier about there was clear linkages between the kind of intermediate industries that came together that then made it possible for the final consumer industries of the 20th century. Going forward, we can do this now with green tech. We can look at what industries might have spillover effects. And when I did my consulting work with Chima, and I started talking about green fibers for clothing, everybody fell asleep. But biopolymers for clothing, if you get into this technology and you commercialize it, will be the basis for a whole new range of plastics. And the spillover effect from that will be huge. But I still think we have to do industrial policy, even though the world is on fire.
And can I add a little bit here?
Of course.
Tiny little bit. And without wanting to comment on that particular point, I want to actually comment on the point of saying on the focus on manufacturing. Okay, so I'm the export side, everything I agree with you on that, the crucial part of it. Whether it should be the manufacturing part is actually feels a bit like as if we've given in to a bunch of accountants, i.e. national accountants, that at some point kind of defined. You already said not everyone is equal. I would actually define it in the spirit that you were talking about. The industries to focus on would be, it could be services, as long as they're clear productivity ladders and as long as they're clearly tradable, i.e. we could export in it. And so actually looking for things that kind of spillover effects and productivity ladders. A huge amount of value added in manufacturing is now services, and it all gets, these sectoral allocations get very muddled. And we should just make sure we don't fall in the trap that it all has to be, and I'm not saying that you implied that, but it should be textiles or garments or which one of the two we pick. Actually, just think productivity ladders where there can be increases, technology spillover, and other forms of economic spillovers.
So, last question for the two of you before we move on to Q&A from the audience. If you could pick a single policy to implement in one country in Africa, what would it be?
Lindsay, why don't you start?
Well, I thought the question was if you could pick one policy. I didn't know it had to be in one country. So I'm going to start with the one policy part, and then maybe the one country will come to me. It's not a policy per se, but it's, to me, I think we talked about this before. Industrial policy is now back on the radar. Everybody, at least in public, says you can do it. But then what they do is expand the word to mean a lot of things. So then I don't even know if we're having the same conversation, because I don't know if what you mean when you say industrial policy is what I mean. But from the perspective that I have been speaking from the beginning, for me, the core characteristic of industrial policy as a concept is that it must support local firms to learn. Everything else is the details, and the actual policies can take so many different forms that Unless we start talking about a specific industry in a specific moment in time, we can get into the details. But that's the key purpose, because whether or not you are entering a mature industry as a country that's very far behind, your local firms aren't competitive. And there is a lot of risk and uncertainty, and they won't put their money there without some of that risk and uncertainty, because I don't think capital is the problem in African countries. They won't put that capital there if they're not confident that they can make it profitable, which requires a longer time frame. And there are many ways to reduce the risk and uncertainty. So again, that's the details of industrial policies. There's no blueprint, and also as a political economist, you might choose a different way to do this depending on the local political economy. But to do industrial policy this way, I'm going to go back to what I said before, because this is the last question. You need to have industry knowledge. I can't say this so many times because there are a lot of panels where people talked across industries. Some people didn't think industrial policy had to be industry specific. And actually, not many people talked about industries. If I'm a nerd, so if we start talking about battery chemistries or pineapple or any of the industries I have studied, you have to get into the nitty-gritty detail. You have to almost be a chemist or an agriculturalist or whatever. You have to understand the industry, and that knowledge has to be created. And there are lots of ways to do that I already mentioned. But you cannot do industrial policy as a government without that knowledge. And that knowledge comes from people who have worked in the industry in actually existing firms that were profitable. Maybe they've exited, maybe that country has exited that industry, and you get people to come over. This is actually what Hyundai used. It used a lot of Americans who then worked in Japan, who then moved from Japan to South Korea. So people move in industries a lot. And actually, if you go into a textile factory, the people running it in Ethiopia are not South Korean, as the firm says, but they're actually from Mauritius and Sri Lanka, because the people are moving and the knowledge is moving with them. So you need engineers and you need businessmen, but you don't need economists.
Stefan, as a former chief economist, do you have a response to that?
Oh, I absolutely have a response to that. And it was just, you do think that too, yes. But, we're very open-minded people, economists. We never really impose our thoughts on anyone, ever. Let me actually come back to your question. You actually asked the question, what policy, what you want to do? And I'm not going to give you first, I'm going to give you two, because one is not an industrial policy. But I just want to repeat all the time, for me, I have post-traumatic stress syndrome of noticing that Malawi always, but never grows, and it's always stagnant and never ever happens. So if we can abolish ATMARC and the National Food Reserve policies and the fertilizer market policies, I'll be a very happy man, because then at last there's a chance for farmers there to make a decent living from and get some food security. But
I will give that a round of applause.
very good, thank you. But I say something actually, and it's a hard one, one policy, because, there is never just one. I'm not a believer in a silver bullet that you can do it. But I want to actually, of a place that I'm very fond of Ethiopia, worked an awful lot. And, there was an awful lot going on, and arguably lots of interesting things. But, then of course, it was sailing close to the wind and macro stabilities. It was very fragile for any shocks that would happen. And unfortunately, that happened. But what I would love now, given that where they are in their economic reforms, that they go back to thinking very carefully, how can we now get some proper private sector FDI back into the country? And actually working hard and doing some of that very hard slog to do it. And I think sometimes I feel they're too tempted to go for G2G and thinking that the Gulf sovereign wealth funds will put some money into things. And I want to just get back firms that are focused on the spillover effects, which was arguably with the industrial policy design in Ethiopia at the time with the parks, they didn't think enough about these spillover things. So let's go back, let's try to populate all the parks, use all the infrastructure, and think a bit more carefully about the spillovers. I thought one of the weaknesses at the time of the industrial policy was, which is I think in general now the case, when you try to get the FDI, you try to solve your growth problem, your forex problem, and your jobs problem. Usually you can't solve all these problems at the same time. increasingly jobs creation in investment in manufacturing, don't do it for the jobs. That's not what you kind of argue either. Do it for the spillover effects in the economy. And don't be too obsessed it has to be for the jobs, because in that sense, Danny Roderick and co are right that the labor intensity of a lot of these firms is much less already now than it used to be. Do it as growth engines, do it as learning engines, as spillover engines, do it as indeed productivity engines for the economy and indeed for exports, and find some. So I would in Ethiopia really would hope that there's kind of a real rethinking of the policy to really attract the FDI back in or more of it, and then pretty hopeful for that place. Yeah.
So now let's open it up for questions. I'll gather up 4 questions and then give those to the panelists. Please keep your questions brief. Begin with your name, affiliation, and your question. And if it is more of a comment than a question, I will cut you off. Blue shirt. Daniel, you are also in a blue shirt. Should I pick some more people with blue shirts? Person in the back who's waving their hand very enthusiastically. And the back row back there as well. Go ahead.
Okay. C'est moi. Sorry. I heard a lot of consensus from both of you that basically we need market-oriented, FDI-driven, export-led growth. And I think, pretty sympathetic to that view. When I talk to governments, though, these other goals intervene. I always hear about the SMEs and the informal sector and the jobs and all these little, businesses. How are we going to support them? How are they going to lead growth? We've heard a lot at this conference also about intra-Africa trade, where everyone has roughly the same comparative advantage, and there's no really big, rich market as there was, for Mexico in the United States. So how do you make the case for the traditional export-led model in the face of these alternative goals?
Daniel?
Hi, I'm Daniel Yu, businessman, now launching the Africa Jobs Fund. Question for Lindsay. I'm trying to reconcile the provocative initial statement of the global demand ladder for existing industries is already full with the idea that you need endogenous knowledge, experience in industries to then innovate into new industries, with, I think, also the initial provocative idea of we shouldn't be doing polyester textile development in Nigeria. We should try to leap into, bio-textile development. So how do you reconcile between this need to have existing knowledge to innovate if you don't have that knowledge already?
And then there were 2 questions in the back row, I believe. Yes, and one on this side, I believe.
Lawrence Nee. Good afternoon. It's Nee Simmons. I'm a non-resident fellow at New America, and I run an initiative called Diaspora Country Index. Question, Dr. Whitfield, you mentioned the importance of a country's, essentially its diaspora, come back, bring its experience, training, education to help develop a country, in this case, TSMC. We're also trying to do that, a couple of us here in advanced manufacturing, especially for semiconductors. How important is it for frontier markets in the global south to engage with their diaspora to assist the global economy with developing some sort of economic growth, their supply chains, which would hopefully lead to jobs? I can't promise jobs, but when you said what you said, I was just thinking that's one of the questions we should be asking ourselves in the era of ODA cuts. How does the country use this as diaspora for benefit? For instance, Ethiopia built this Grand Renaissance Dam just based on electricity, and its diaspora financed a third of it. Thank you.
And I believe there's one More question in the back row?
Thank you very
not
much.
quite the back row. Sorry, I am looking directly into light, so it is hard to see anyone's faces past about the second row.
All good. Thank you very much, Nicholas Pieringer, Harvard University. My question is for Stefan. I was quite curious about the last point you made where when picking sectors for manufacturing, don't focus on jobs, focus on the potential to kind of go up the ladder and move into new products. My question for you, especially considering the political feasibility of such a question, is what about the jobs then? You know, we have hundreds of millions of, new youth coming into sub-Saharan Africa, and especially if a government is considering it has limited capability, jumping into these kinds of, somewhat opaque future sectors may be a difficult task for them in the future. How do you kind of provide the bargain such that it's compelling from the jobs end as well?
Go ahead.
Thank
I
you.
mean, there are questions
Yeah.
for both of you,
So
go ahead.
I'll take the ones that were to me and also the SME one. So Daniel is a very good question, and I could see how in the short time it could be a bit confusing. So the short answer is you can't leapfrog. So all of the evidence that I have seen is that you have to build up the capability. So I didn't mean to imply that you didn't have to start from scratch. I'm just saying that in the end, the wealth is going to come from making that innovation. And in mature industries, the profit margins are thin. So some economists may say the cost-benefit analysis doesn't make sense to invest all this money because your return is very small. But from a technological capabilities point, it's necessary. And that's why sometimes you need to subsidize. I'm using the word subsidy in a very broad sense. You can subsidize in all kinds of ways. But also if you hit scale, then you actually can be quite profitable with thin margins. And we see that in a lot of Taiwanese and Chinese firms in mature markets. And that's exactly why it's difficult for latecomers to enter. These companies are making razor-thin margins. Like the research that I have done, the transnational apparel companies, even those linked to textile from Sri Lanka, South Korea, Hong Kong, they make very thin margins. The biggest of the biggest apparel companies in the world are struggling to capture value from retailers, and the retailers are giving all their values to shareholders, but we can talk about that later. So the point is that if you just look at the return, there's no business case to move into the mature industry, but you have to do it to build capabilities. It's a longer term project, and it's harder to do now, so I don't have all the answers, by the way. In the past, it was done by protecting markets and giving firms higher profit margins in domestic markets, where they then sold into export markets at much lower prices to be competitive. So then there was a shift. Sometimes it works through diversified business groups and conglomerates that can shift money around and that they can sustain in mature industries with low profit margins while they're learning. So there are different ways to do it, but I guess what I wanted to say is that's why development's so hard, right? Because you can't skip these steps as we actually thought maybe that you could do. So we looked at some cases of leapfrogging, and then we realized that they weren't really leapfrogging. China didn't leapfrog. It built up systematic manufacturing capabilities. And that's why you have to try, and there'll be failures. But if you get one Hyundai for every whatever, then I think it's okay. On the talking to governments about, so I don't know, my experience in the past is that the obsession with SMEs in the informal sector came from donors. I could be wrong, and maybe our governments have now internalized that. I don't know. I stopped doing research on aid 15 years ago. What I do know is that they're obsessed with jobs, which is obvious, and we've talked about that a lot of times. So I think it's about convincing them that they can achieve their electoral political goals through multiple different policies. What I have found from, and I did research in Ghana for 15 years, and then Ethiopia, but I've also done research in Madagascar, Mauritius, Kenya, South Africa. There are multiple strategies to achieve their political goals. But the idea basket is pretty small, what they're being offered. We had the panel about think tanks. I'm not sure if they're offering something new or not, I can't say, but I think that if you are meeting their political objectives and their electoral goals, and you offer different industrial policies to do that, there could at least be a dialogue. But then I think, as we talked about, that I think that has to come from within government, and there are lots of people who can be brought in to build up these different ideas. And this leads me to the third point, which is about the diaspora. So I think one of the most amazing stories is from brain drain to brain circulation, which is Taiwan's story, and it's also a story of some other countries as well. So we used to, in the 90s, say brain drain is so bad. But actually, you could flip it on the other side. It's the glass is half empty or the glass is half full. So if those people have gone out and they've gotten degrees in the US, in Europe, but in the stories I know it's the US, and then they began working in companies in the frontier technologies. Most of the stories take place in Silicon Valley, which is where frontier technology is born. And then you encourage them back through different ways, and there are lots of ways that this could happen. And in the initial way in Taiwan, it was just by advising. So Morris Cheng was an advisor first, then he was head of a government institute, and then they built a semiconductor firm, and then it was spin-off, and then he headed, and now we have TSMC. It's a long story. But if you know the origins of TSMC and where it came from, it's doable. It's not pie in the sky. And I think the work that you say that you're doing sounds fascinating and very important. And I think that's the kind of thing that needs to be done, because you need to attract people who have experience, the technical, but also business, because they bring the technical knowledge, the frontier technology. I have a paper that just came out in a debate about renewables capitalism, where I say pathways out of the periphery are possible, going back to Haggard. But you need to get into these new technologies early, and you have to do that by tapping into the technological frontier. So I was debating against a lot of neo-dependency, which is actually popular again now. There's no such thing as independent development. All the success cases have been interdependent. So we need to embrace the foreignness and all this, but endogenize it within local firms. And that happens through those who have the technology, who have the business contacts. And let's be clear, Silicon Valley was an old boys club. So having overseas ethnic Chinese in firms who could then vouch for Taiwanese firms nobody heard of, who could then offer them their first contracts to produce contract manufacturing electronics, was important for the birth of Acer and many other companies that you have heard of. I think your question was how important is it for frontier markets, but it's absolutely necessary.
So well, I'll take that last question, and arguably it links to an element of this question on jobs and SMEs and informal sector as well. I mean, it's, you know, when you look at the data on historical development of manufacturing and growth in recent times, there are very few countries where the growth of manufacturing jobs outpaced the growth in jobs in the services sector. That's probably England in the 19th century and China. Most other countries, if you think of Bangladesh building up a garment industry, yeah, not necessarily with all the externalities that Lindsay was referring to, but that's a couple of million people in a labor market of 70 million people, okay? The point I want to make is that we make an error, and I do think, for example, in Ethiopia, wanted to say, look, we bring these things in because they will be the job engines. We have to be willing to say, look, how will we create jobs in economies? In fact, even in all over the world, SMEs are the engines of job creation. Micro enterprises are engines of job creation. But it's actually to think very carefully about, and not trying to expect that everything you do, that all these things come together. So bringing in things like FDI or being able to use, to the extent, we will all have different views of how far we can go, but it's about trying to engage with productivity frontiers. It's to try to boost productivity, one way or another doing this. That's already hard enough. And you may not in every country be able to do that in everything. And if you say, oh, no, that has to be at the same time, the engine for exports, I say, okay, that's actually good because it's disciplining for that. But it also has to be the one for jobs. That's actually not necessarily totally aligned objective. It may be, but it isn't. Now, you didn't ask me, design me a full sensible economic and development and poverty alleviation policy.
I mean, I'm not opposed to you doing that.
Well, you may want to do this, but the point is linking these two questions. Of course, what I want to explain if I get a chance, if I want to make my argument to a policymaker in a country, say, you really must have a jobs policy. Okay, so I will say, I know this is being streamed, I may get in trouble, but I do quite a lot of work with the Prime Minister's office in Pakistan. I'm very struck that I'm the one that has to say, well, you need to have something on jobs as well. You can't just simply getting your macro, your trade balance okay, and your exports. It has to be, they need to have it. It needs to be politically feasible for them to do, and whatever it is. And arguably they're closer to what Lindsay is saying. But, jobs matter. But just realize that they will largely come from the externalities, from the spillovers, and we come back to other things, which is urbanization policies. It's like go to China, you talk to, again, people in Development Research Center, they once berated me because we made a distinction between urbanization policies and industrialization policies, and they told us these are two sides of the same coin. And so you need to think about it there. And it brings me back to that point. It's like, look, if you do industrial parks, for example, as one vehicle to actually centralize industrial policy, it's very striking that in Africa, the distance of the industrial parks to any concentration of population, and Joe will have talked to you all about the importance of population concentration, it's multiples of what it was in China. So there's clearly something going wrong with these things. And you say, well, if you want jobs, it's not about having a lot of firms in your industrial parks, but also think about your location, your linkages, and the kind of thing. And that's, I think, where it needs to come together. SMEs will be engines for crop creation and so on, having that kind of ecosystem around it. How to engineer, because the firm that invests may not necessarily want to buy the cotton locally or whatever it is. It is not an easy thing to get these linkages, but thinking various ways around it. And basically services sectors and growth in jobs in service sectors in urban areas are probably the engines of job creation when you have some other engines of growth in high productivity sectors that are pushing the frontier.
Thank you both so much. This has been very enlightening. I think that is the end of our panel, at only 5 minutes over time. No, I think we have to have a photo first.
Oh, sorry.
Esteemed speakers, please remain on the stage for the group photo. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Kartik Akileswaran for the conference wrap-up. Kartik Akileswaran, the floor is yours.
Before everyone vacates, I'm just gonna say a couple things. I won't use the podium. I'll keep it brief. I'm not even gonna try to recap what's been an information-rich and provocative 2 days. Luckily, is there something appearing on the... Yeah. So luckily, all throughout the event, we've had Bianca producing artistic sketches of all the sessions that aim to capture the key highlights and takeaways. So we'll be sharing those with everyone after the event. We've also recorded all of the sessions, so if anyone has said something that they don't want to be made public, please alert us. But those will be posted. Videos of all the sessions will be posted soon after. If I made just one key reflection that I've had talking to various people the last couple of days, the vibes, so to speak, have been sky high. To quote one of the guests here, the event has been not too shallow, not too stuffy, and not too academic. Now, there's a negative interpretation of that, which is that it's just been totally average. I'm going to choose to interpret it positively. And I would say, I would chalk this up to all of you more, as much or more than anything that we as the organizers necessarily did. So first, we'd like to express a huge amount of gratitude to all of you for coming from different corners of the world, for bringing an eclectic range of perspectives and experiences and questions, and for being open to engaging with new people and ideas. We also thank all of the speakers for the insight and thoughtfulness that they brought to their comments and presentations. My initial impression is that we've made some positive progress on the task that Shema laid out for us yesterday morning. That government representatives here have learned about growth experiences that perhaps they weren't so familiar with before. That funders here have seen more concrete pathways through which they can engage in the true epic adventure of development, to quote one of my favorite economists, Albert Hirschman. And that practitioners and researchers and others have formed or strengthened relationships that may lead to productive partnership and collaboration around the growth enterprise going forward. Finally, last but not least, the huge effort that this event couldn't have been done without a number of people in this room. So first to Miriam, Hadija, Sophia, all the volunteers at PCNS, the whole PCNS staff. There's absolutely no way we could have planned and executed this event without the tremendous support we received from you at such a fantastic venue as this. Thanks to CGD, to Marcus and Charlie, particularly for your openness and flexibility and problem solving as we iterated what felt like 100 times on various aspects of the agenda and the structure and so on. And thanks to my team at Growth Teams, Shema and Jonathan, for the dozens, maybe hundreds of days and nights that we all spent making this a reality. With that, we close this second edition of the Growth Summit. And if we get enough positive feedback, you never know. We may invite you back for a third go around. Thank you. One point of logistics, those of you staying at La Tour Hassan in town, you can go ahead and make your way to the bus. It'll be there waiting for you. Those of you staying at the campus hotel, the bus will be out front of the building around 6:30. Thank you.